Good morning, students. Students, one of the best known writers in English, Vidyadhar Suraj Prasad Naipaul, popularly known as V.S. Naipaul, is a product of post imperialist society. Imperialism played a key role in bringing a sense of alienation and disorder to the countries where imperialists ruled. Students, V.S. Naipaul was born in rural Trinidad. He was a grandson of indentured servants from South Asia who came to work on Trinidad sugarcane plantation. His father, Sri Prasad Naipaul, was a journalist on whom the character of Mr. Biswas is based. His mother belonged to prominent Kapildev family, the model for Tulsi family in the novel A House for Mr. Biswas. V.S. Naipaul moved from the countryside to Port of Spain at the age of 6, and here he attended Trinidad's best regarded secondary school. Afterwards, he won a scholarship to Oxford, and here he somewhat felt out of place and suffered a self described nervous breakdown. After graduating in 1953 from Oxford, the same year of his father's death, Naipaul lived the rest of his life in England. He married his classmate Patricia Hale in the year 1955. While living in London and writing his first novel, The Mystic Mysore, and the other book of short stories, Michael Street, he started writing, but he found literary fame only after the 1961 publication of A House for Mr. Biswas and began writing non-fiction soon thereafter. He published travelogues of the Caribbean and India entitled The Middle Passage and An Area of Darkness. Students, he lived his later part of life in a cottage in the English countryside and ultimately published more than a dozen novels and many other books of non-fiction. He was knighted in the year 1990, and the Swedish Academy awarded him the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 2001. Students, V.S. Naipaul's magnum opus, A House for Mr. Biswas, can rightly be called a work of art that deals with the problem of isolation, frustration, and negation of an individual. This novel tells the story of its protagonist, Mr. Biswas, from birth to death, each section dealing with different phases of Mr. Biswas's life. Carol Boyce Davis has truly remarked, I quote, migration creates desire for home, which in turn produces the rewriting of home. Homesickness or homelessness, the rejection of home or longing for home become motivating factors in this rewriting. Home can only have meaning when one experiences a level of displacement from it. Unquote. Students, in the novel, the image of house is a central unifying and integrating metaphor around which the life of Mr. Biswas revolves. Mr. Biswas For Mr. Biswas, the house represents a search for emancipation from dependence. The novel paints a poignant picture of Mr. Biswas as he struggles to preserve his own identity in an alien environment and tries to forge his own identity. The life of Mr. Biswas resembles the life of Naipaul himself, whose series of experiences of exile and alienation while living in Trinidad seem to be portrayed through the character of his protagonist, Mr. Biswas. In the novel, Naipaul addresses the problem of alienation, exile, and displacement with a positive approach. He presents Mr. Biswas's relentless struggle against the forces that try to subdue his individuality. His struggle is long and tiresome, but in the end, he is successful in having a space he can call his own. The novelist describes a house for Mr. Biswas in his non fiction book Finding the Center, and he says, "It was very much my father's book." In his Nobel Award ceremony acceptance speech, Naipaul alludes to a house for Mr. Biswas, saying that intuition led me to a large book about my family life. Students, from the very beginning, Mohan Biswas, the protagonist, is depicted as a marginalized individual who is constantly on the move to identify his place in the limited world of Trinidad. The character of Mr. Biswas is carved out of alienated experience as he tries to find his own roots in the socio-cultural environment around him. In the search of his own identity, Mohan Biswas shifts from village to town and from joint family to a nuclear family, but ultimately fails to find his own roots amidst socio-cultural change. Students, the first section of the novel, entitled Pastorals, describes the birth and early childhood of Mr. Biswas. Here we find a Hindu way of life with its customs, traditions, rituals, and philosophy of the people receives full expression in the small Indian word created by the indentured Indian laborers in an artificially created colonial society of Trinidad. Here too, it is the superstitious belief, the faith and reliance on pandits which cover the initial pages of the novel. Here we see Mr. Biswas becomes a lonely individual who is trying to get a new social role but fails to find it. Naipaul portrays the complexity of the relationship between a man and his origins and his inability to escape from it. Aware of his loneliness and dilemma, Mr. Biswas tells his son, "I am just somebody, nobody at all." Unlike his father and brothers, who have inherited the social identity of laborers, this cannot be claimed by Mr. Biswas. Students, we see Mr. Biswas is looking after his uncle's shop while his brothers are working as laborers. After leaving his uncle's store, he takes up a job as a sign painter where he meets Sharma, a daughter of the Tulsis, who are an affluent family of the island. Mr. Biswas later marries her. His marriage makes him realize that life, even after a love marriage, is not a romance but an act of responsibility. Without money and without a dowry from the Tulsis, Mr. Biswas has no choice but to move to Hanuman house. He develops a mental complex due to the disagreeable family atmosphere. For Mr. Biswas, it is a typical joint family which functions on the same pattern as the British Empire in the West Indies. This Hanuman house provides shelter to Mr. Biswas but wants total dilution of his identity in return. When Mr. Biswas finds out that men are only needed as husbands and laborers, or that they are non existent in the Tulsi family, his inner self rebels. He finds himself unwanted in Hanuman house, which he sees as a communal organization where he was treated with indifference rather than hostility. Although he tries to win acceptance in the family, he held his tongue and tried to win favor. This does not mean that he is willing to lose his freedom and independence. When Govind, one of Tulsi's son-in-law, suggests that he leave sign painting and become a driver for the Tulsi state, Mr. Biswas immediately voices his dissent. He refuses to adopt a profession which is associated with the Tulsis, and he is not ready to merge himself to insignificance like other son-in-laws, some of whose names are even forgotten in the Tulsi family. To assert his freedom in Hanuman House, Mr. Biswas joins the Aryans, a group of Protestant Hindu missionaries from India, and starts advocating the acceptance of conversion and women's education on one hand, and the abolition of caste system, child marriage, and idol worship on the other, knowing that these doctrines will anger Tulsi. Similarly, in order to assert his individuality and to get acknowledged, Mr. Biswas takes up means that are as absurd as they are comic. Even when Mr. Biswas's daughter is born, it is Seth and Hari who chose the name Sabi for his daughter, not Mr. Biswas himself. To register his protest, Mr. Biswas writes on the birth certificate, real calling name Lakshmi, signed by Mohan Biswas' father. Students, our today's lecture comes to an end, and we will continue with the discussion on this novel in our further chapters, in our further lectures. Thank you very much.